the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, June 30th, 2015. A new study has found that right-wing ideology is driving terrorist activity, even more than radical Islam. My guest, David Sterman of New America Foundation, will delve into the numbers and what they mean. And as part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, I'll be interviewing acclaimed Professor Noam Chomsky on American imperialism. Plus, taking a look at Monday's Supreme Court ruling on the EPA's ability to regulate coal plants will be my guest, Dahr, Jamail. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
President Obama, in an op-ed in the Huffington Post, just announced his proposal to raise the pay threshold for overtime wage protections. Under the current and outdated law, workers who make $23,660 or less are automatically eligible for overtime pay protections. Only 8% of all workers fall into that category. Under Obama's proposal, those making $50,440 a year or less would be protected, or at least 44% of the workforce. The president wrote, quote, "In this country, a hard day's work deserves a fair day's pay. That's at the heart of what it means to be middle class in America." He plans to discuss the proposed bill in detail in Wisconsin this week. Predictably, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce complained that Obama's plan was, quote, "completely divorced from reality and adding more burdens to employers and expecting them to just absorb the impact." Well, Bob, the president has been riding high on his recent successes at the Supreme Court. What do you make of this proposal?
Well, first of all, the business community's response is predictable. Anytime there's an attempt to give workers rights, the business community will tell you it's going to collapse the economy. It tends not to, so we can put that aside. I think what we should focus on this particular proposal is it's a wholly inadequate response. And it's interesting that there's even debate about that. So to readjust the overtime law for inflation and give more people access to the mandated time and a half is perfectly sensible. But it's an inadequate response to the crisis in labor markets. We should be looking at why businesses put the screws to people to make them work more than 40 hours a week. That means they don't hire more people. That undermines economic stability. There's a whole lot of issues wrapped up in this one simple time and a half for overtime proposal that we should be talking about. And I hope that the president can push that kind of discussion forward.
The Supreme Court issued two more rulings yesterday that progressives are cheering. First, by a 5-4 vote, justices temporarily halted the implementation of a Texas law that would have effectively shuttered a majority of reproductive health clinics offering abortion services. The reprieve will enable Texas clinics to continue operating while the court decides whether or not to take up the case later this year. And in a separate ruling, the Supreme Court decided that Arizona voters had the right to create an independent redistricting commission despite the GOP-dominated state legislature's argument that only lawmakers had the right to draw district lines. Arizonans voted 15 years ago on Proposition 106 to create such a commission. The justices who ruled in favor of the commission argued that voters have the ultimate authority to decide on methods of democratic decision-making. Arizona's lawmakers have often governed far to the right of the state's population. Bob, what do you make of these two rulings?
Well, I think this is an example of how the U.S. Supreme Court is a place where high-minded individuals debate on matters of intellectual principle. Okay, that was my attempt at a joke. I mean, I've never seen a time that I've been paying attention when the Supreme Court was more overtly politicized. You know, we pretend that the Supreme Court decisions are a matter of law, and certainly legal principles and legal doctrines matter. But we've seen a highly politicized court making decisions from both the liberal and the conservative side, I think, that are motivated by politics. And I think this is one of those cases. On the abortion decision, it's not clear what the court's angling for because there was no explanation of why they stayed this. It's a good thing that that horrendous abortion law in Texas, where I live, has been put on hold. It's a serious attack on women's rights. But it's hard to know where any of this is going.
And the Supreme Court also ruled yesterday to allow the practice of execution by lethal injection. On tomorrow's Uprising, we'll have a live in-studio discussion about it with actor Mike Farrell, president of Death Penalty Focus. Later in the show today, we'll speak with Dahr Jamail about the court's ruling on the EPA. And finally, a newly revealed Justice Department report on how police handled last year's unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, concluded that law enforcement badly mishandled the situation. The St. Louis Post-Dispatch obtained the DOJ report and found that police responded with an uncoordinated effort that sometimes violated free speech rights, antagonized crowds with military-style tactics, and shielded officers from accountability. Among the tactics that the report denounced was a failure of commanders to provide more details to the public after Officer Darren Wilson killed Michael Brown, and the use of dogs for crowd control, plus the fact that tear gas was sometimes used without warning and on people in areas from which there was no retreat. Also inappropriate was the practice of positioning an officer atop an armored vehicle to monitor the crowd through rifle sights, and the arbitrary nature of arrests and the use of force. Well, Bob, the media spotlight has moved away from Ferguson. How important is it for this report to be widely read and reported on?
Well, it should be, of course, and I'm not going to hold my breath for the mainstream media to do that, so I hope Uprising continues to press these issues. This is interesting because there are a lot of problems with modern policing, but two fundamental problems, and both of them are on display in this issue in Ferguson. One is, of course, racialized disparities, especially racialized disparities in the use of force and deadly force. We saw that, and we've seen it in other places. The other is this hyper-militarization of police forces. This is a serious issue. Now, we saw this play out in cycles. It happened in the famous Battle for Seattle in 1999. The police recognized their tactics had been inappropriate, and they changed. But unfortunately, that change has led toward this more militarized urban police forces. These are serious questions that should be on the agenda. And in addition to the racialized disparities, that militarization of the police needs to be kept front and center.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Judging by the priorities of the U.S. government and media coverage, most Americans likely view the threat of radical Islam as the greatest source of terrorism in the United States today. But they would be wrong. Twice as wrong, in fact, as per the results of a new survey conducted by New America Foundation. The group tallied attacks by individuals claiming to be jihadists and compared the numbers with attacks by people espousing right-wing extremist and anti-government ideology. Since 9/11, people like Boston Marathon bomber Dzhokhar Tsarnaev have killed 26 in the U.S., whereas those like Charleston shooter Dylan Roof have killed 48 people. There have been 7 instances of jihadi terror and 19 instances of right-wing terror. Joining me to parse these numbers is David Sterman, Program Associate at New America. He has a master's from Georgetown's Center for Security Studies, and his work focuses on homegrown extremism and the maintenance of New America's data sets on terrorism inside the U.S. Welcome to Uprising, David.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first, how did you decide on which deadly incident to include in this data set? Did you use a definition of terrorism and then just cast a net based on that? And if so, what definition of terrorism? Because, of course, there isn't a formal consensus.
Right. So we track these incidents of extremist violence based on court documents and newspapers. We try to apply a consistent methodology that there has to be some sort of political aspect to the action or the violent incident. We don't include just what seem to be more personal hate crimes or just criminal activity. It has to be deadly for this particular tally. And it either has to have been charged as a crime or possible to charge as a crime, but have resulted in the individual's death before they could have been charged.
So any incident that had a sort of a political ideology behind it. Now, the FBI does have a definition of terrorism, and for example, in the latest attack in the on the Charleston church in South Carolina, at which 9 people were killed by Dylan Roof, which you include in the data set, the FBI decided that that was not a terror attack. So what's going on there?
Right. Our tally is a broader definition than the particular statutes the government has used. For example, on the jihadist side, we include Nidal Hassan, who was actually charged with a series of murder charges rather than a terrorism charge, because our focus is on that political violence and to a lesser extent on the particular law that was applied, as that's often applied inconsistently depending on what is most prosecutable and on the politics of the moment.
Your data set also excluded the Chapel Hill shooting of 3 Muslims earlier this year in March. Why?
Right. Tallies like this are highly subjective, and we certainly encourage other people to produce different tallies. Our judgment, based on what we had been reading about the case, is that it's not clear that that incident was an act of terrorism with a political motivation for the attack itself, as opposed to that sort of more individualized hate crime. So
right. In this case, there was, you suggested there was, because there was a little bit of a vagueness to the killer's motives, that he might have killed them over a parking ticket, that you were being a little conservative and thus excluded this particular incident?
That's part of it, but it's not just the question of whether it was a parking ticket dispute, but also the question of, was there really a political motivation there, or was it a more personalized hate that was not connected to a broader political ideology or attempt to establish a politics?
So what is the common thread in the right-wing attacks? I mentioned 19 such attacks since 2001, September 11, 2001, 7 attacks in the other category of jihadi terror, quote unquote. What is the common thread in the right-wing attacks? The Charleston shooter was clearly motivated by white supremacist ideology. But if you look at, for example, the 2009 assassination of Dr. George Tiller, that was motivated by anti-abortion beliefs. Although I understand Tiller's murderer was a member of the Sovereign Citizens Movement. Is white supremacy a common thread?
So it's difficult to tell which of the threads combine in which incidents. It's one of the things that requires far more study here. There do appear to be, by what we're tracking as right-wing, consists of 3 separate threads. One is the white supremacist movement. One is the anti-government movement that includes both the remnants and parts of the patriot and militia movements, but also the sovereign citizen movement, individuals who are aligned with that and then take it to the level of violence. And then there's the anti-abortion extremist movement, so the Tiller, killing of Dr. Tiller case. And those 3 trends combine at points. At other points, they're relatively separate. And the effort to determine to what extent these are merging, diverging, is very difficult at the moment, because there's not a lot of independent tracking of this type of incident when everyone is focused on the jihadist threat.
Right. So, and I want to get to that. So, what about the sort of demographics of the 2 data sets? I tried to look through the column that tallies up right-wing incidents of terrorism, and I could only find one woman, Shauna Ford, who was involved in the attack in Arizona against a Latino man and his daughter. But I understand that, or if not all the rest, at least most of the rest are men, and almost all of the perpetrators in that column are white. Is it safe to say that that is an accurate demographic?
On the gender aspect, that's certainly safe to say, and that's something that is pretty consistent across ideologies. In our jihadist sample, we found only 21 women, since 9/11 charged with jihadist terrorism crimes or who died before they could be charged, which is only a small percentage of the 290 odd people indicted. On the ethnicity, it's harder to tell, but it certainly looks like the vast majority of the right-wing or non-jihadist sample are Caucasian, whereas on the jihadist end, there's a vast diversity of ethnicities that are represented among people who have committed jihadist terrorism-related crimes.
And of course, when the government puts resources into these sorts of issues and pays attention to these issues and tries to determine how to protect the public, they do rely, whether they like to admit it or not, on racial profiling. And so, it's interesting to see this data set. And also, they rely on certain numbers to determine where to put resources. What do you think your data set can teach the government that they might not have been paying attention to? Certainly, it seems as though the government has been paying much more attention to radical Islam than white supremacist or anti-abortion groups.
So I think, first of all, it's worth noting that though every death in these incidents is tragic, the numbers are actually quite low. So in looking at how to prevent incidents, it's important to acknowledge that there's not a white supremacist insurgency, there's not a right-wing vast insurgency in the United States. That said, it does appear that the right-wing or anti-government and white supremacist extremism has been largely ignored. Often these incidents are dismissed as lone cases, even when they do appear to have organizational aspects connected to it, which can lead people to think that they don't have to provide a tip regarding extremist activity or someone who may be taking preparations to conduct an attack, which is dismissed as that person is just crazy, not that person is on the verge of an act of extremist violence.
Now, how well known are these numbers among law enforcement, both local and federal law enforcement circles? Do police and the FBI know that the resources that are allocated to these two different types of violence are not necessarily based on reality?
It's hard to tell internally to various law enforcement offices what the balance of attention is and how that's being treated. But it certainly appears that many local law enforcement officials do prioritize and see their biggest threat as non-jihadist terrorism. There was a survey recently of law enforcement officers that found that far and away more of them put anti-government extremism as a more direct threat that they deal with more often than jihadist or al-Qaeda related terrorism.
And how does generalized gun violence fit into this picture? I mean, for example, we don't, your data set didn't include James Holmes, who opened fire on the Colorado movie theater as being something motivated by right-wing ideology. He's using the mental illness defense, and yet Nidal Hassan, the Army psychiatrist who shot and killed 13 people in Fort Hood in 2009, is considered a terrorist shooter, even though he had also clearly struggled with mental illness. Now, he shouted Allahu Akbar before he fired. He did have strong critiques of the war in Afghanistan. The Army, as you discussed earlier, did not charge him with terrorism, but that incident did make your list while James Holmes didn't. Both of those involved mass gun violence.
So on the Nidal Hassan case, just there, it does look like he had a pretty clear political motivation in that case, which is why we do include him. The charges were, there's a whole discussion of why he wasn't charged with terrorism, a lot having to do with the military can't really charge under a terrorism statute effectively. But on the mass shootings, that's the absolutely necessary side of discussion. We're focused on the political violence. There's important reasons why we care more about political violence, in that if you allow politically violent organizations to grow up, they can pose a much greater ability to adapt and cause sudden shifts in the threat. However, the numbers of people who are killed just by non-political gun violence are far and away higher than both jihadist and non-jihadist violence combined.
Absolutely, that is a very, very important point, and we do certainly discuss that on our program quite a bit. Were you surprised, by the way, speaking of, who is determined to be a terrorist by various government agencies or not, were you surprised when the government decided not to pursue terrorism charges against Dylan Roof? Because he was very clear about his political motivations in his killings. He chose his targets extremely carefully. He made, on a website, clearly stated what his goal was and what he was, what motivated him politically and ideologically.
Right. I think in the case of Dylan Roof, it certainly appears from what we know of the case and the alleged attacker that this fits the definition of terrorism that's widely used by scholars and the government pretty clearly. Now, the question of what you actually charge someone with is somewhat different. There's a whole level of questions of, do you actually need that to get the highest sentence? Will you be able to prove it in a court? So there's a set of questions there that are somewhat different. In addition, I think it should be noted that there's still some question of whether the government may charge Roof with a terrorism.
Right, that door is still open.
Right, and it has in other cases come back later to add terrorism enhancements to simple murder charges.
And certainly even, the use of the word terrorism is a political issue, whether, if we set aside the legal aspects of using that term, it does have a political impact on the public at large and the public's perceptions, which is why a study like yours, I think, is so important, because it puts the reality of what we're seeing into perspective. Now, on the issue of the rise of right-wing supremacist and anti-government militias and ideology, I noticed that 16 out of the 19 right-wing terror attacks in your data set took place in 2009 or after, which may be linked to the election of President Barack Obama?
That's one possible interpretation, but our numbers there are really not sufficient to draw any conclusions on that point. There's a large issue of how often things are reported, whether there's underreporting. There's a variety of other potential causes for how incidents can rise or fall, law enforcement pressure, other political winds. There's a very large debate regarding whether right-wing extremist movements, militia movements, other groups are actually rising at the moment or falling or staying the same. And really, that's something that there just needs to be far more data. But unfortunately, with the focus on the jihadist threat, there's been a far less focus on other threats that may rise.
Right, and we've been hearing news of the KKK recruiting or attempting to recruit people to join their hate fest with flyers in various parts of the country, various cities in the country as well. But their aspirations may not necessarily translate into actual numbers and recruits, right?
Right, there's always a question of both to what extent are these organizations, as the organization itself, involved in the violence as opposed to individuals who may have links back to it or may even be highly critical of the organization. But also, how real is an organization that's engaged in flyering? Is that a couple of people or is that a well-developed organization? And that's a question that really there's very little data on at the moment.
Finally, David, does the government need to be keeping track of exactly what you're keeping track of and using, formal definitions to accurately figure out what really is a threat or what kind of ideology or movement really is a threat in the country?
I think it's absolutely essential that the government be collecting various numbers on these types of threats and looking at it. There's a very big question of to what extent the government should be involved in tracking it on an ideological basis. And that's something that needs to be taken very carefully. The government tends to prefer to focus on particular incidents, rightfully so, since everyone has a right to be extreme. It's one of the most precious rights that makes America what America is. So it's important not to invalidate that. On the other hand, different ideologies and different groups of people need to be treated the same, and there should be one standard for similar types of attacks, not one standard for jihadist violence, regardless of the level of the threat, and one standard for everyone else.
Well, David, I want to thank you so much for joining us today. Give out a website where people can explore this data set in detail themselves.
You can find our data on this and a variety of other aspects at securitydata.newamerica.net.
securitydata.newamerica.net, and New America's own website is newamerica.org. We'll post those links to our website, uprisingwithsonali.com, later today. Thanks so much, David.
Thank you.
My guest, David Sterman, is a program associate at New America and has a master's from Georgetown's Center for Security Studies. His work focuses on homegrown extremism and the maintenance of New America's data sets on terrorism inside the United States. This is Uprising. We're going to take a short break. Later in the hour, Dahr Jamail will join us to discuss the Supreme Court's ruling on the EPA's regulation of mercury emissions. And after the short break, we'll hear the next part in our ongoing series from the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, this time featuring Noam Chomsky. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. The issue of national security is constantly invoked by politicians and the media as justifications for war and surveillance. Since the September 11th attacks, the U.S. has launched endless wars that have ironically made us less safe and built an unprecedented network of intrusive surveillance. Today, as part of an ongoing series of interviews that I did with a number of experts, journalists, authors, and academics, we'll explore what the U.S.'s national security policies have really amounted to. The interviews were produced by Brave New Films, headed by the acclaimed filmmaker Robert Greenwald, and they're called the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. Henry A. Wallace was the 33rd Vice President of the United States. He served under Franklin Delano Roosevelt during World War II and ran for the presidency on the Progressive Party ticket in 1948. He was an agriculturalist, economist, author, and businessman. And Mr. Wallace was known as the champion of the common man in the struggle against the moneyed elites for control of government and the planet's resources. On today's episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we present my interview on what drives American empire with Noam Chomsky, the legendary political analyst, professor emeritus of linguistics at MIT, and author of over 100 books. He has been one of the most cited people in the world, both for his work on linguistics and his political analysis. Helps us answer the big question: why does the United States seem driven to create an empire? Welcome to the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Many Americans are not accustomed to the idea that our country sits at the top of a global empire. But with military bases in dozens of countries, interventions in other countries' political processes, and all-out invasions, there's no other word to describe our trajectory. But why are we so prone to empire building? Joining me to answer that question is renowned author, linguist, and political commentator, Professor Noam Chomsky. Welcome to the program.
Glad to be with you.
Where do do you think the U.S.'s aspirations for empire come from? Is it the nature of any state to pursue military domination, or do you think there's something specific to U.S. history that this country is particularly prone to imperialism because of?
A good explanation of it was given by John Lewis Gaddis. Expansion is the path to security. If you want to be secure, you have to control everything else. The commitment to empire goes back to the original colonization. By the Second World War, the United States was in a position of unprecedented power. At the end of the Second World War, the U.S. literally had half the world's wealth. The tacit assumption was, we own the world. You can see this very clearly in what happened as soon as this system of power began to erode, and that happened very quickly. In 1949, China became independent. There's a name for that in American political history. It's called the loss of China. The phrase loss of China expresses the tacit assumption that basically we own China, and if it moves to independence, we've lost it. And since we own most of the world in this sense, we have to defend it, so we have to have 1,000 military bases, military forces almost as great as the rest of the world combined, and it runs right through American history. This fear of everything is pervasive. It goes back to the origins of the society. It's related to the imperial thrust of, as Gaddis put it, attaining security through expansion, and that's limitless essentially. So that's the imperial thrust. It's not unique to the United States. It's developed in an extreme form here, but that's because of extraordinary U.S. wealth and power.
How intertwined is corporatism and the drive for profit with our militarism? Is it always the case that the drive for access to resources tends to drive our militarism?
Well, if you take a look through history again, in the 19th century, the major commodity, the equivalent of oil today, was cotton. That was the source of the Industrial Revolution. Jacksonian presidents of the mid-19th century explained very clearly that they wanted to conquer Texas and a large part of Mexico, approximately half, in order to try to gain a monopoly over cotton. President Polk said that that would bring England to our feet by gaining a monopoly of the major commodity in the world, cotton. Move on a few years, oil becomes the major commodity. And incidentally, it's not a matter of primarily of access to oil. During the whole period when the U.S. was the major producer and didn't need access to the oil, its policies were the same. The issue was control over oil, not access. And there was a reason for that. When the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003, Zbigniew Brzezinski said if it works, it'll be very good because controlling Iraqi oil and increasing our control over Middle East oil will give us what he called critical leverage over Europe and other industrial powers. We'll be in a position to hold the spigot. I've just talked about two of the major commodities. You look at others and you get pretty much the same story.
Now, you've written a lot about mass media and how it is often used to manufacture consent from the U.S. public for things like war and strengthening U.S. empire. But today we have a significantly changed media landscape, at least it seems so. And I'm wondering if you feel that we as citizens are still prone to the kind of brainwashing that we once were.
People are deluged with a single message. We're defending ourselves. So take a look at the invasion of Iraq, let's say. Barack Obama is considered a critic, but notice his grounds. Not that aggression is wrong, not that destruction of a society by violence is wrong, It's that it was a blunder. So that implies that if the aggression and violence had succeeded, expanding our control over one of the major resources of the contemporary world, giving us critical leverage over our rivals, then it wouldn't have been stupid, would have been fine. That's called criticism. The worst criticism that can be made within the mainstream of U.S. policy is it was a mistake. These are the standard views of what are called statesmen, people who are committed to defending and expanding powerful interests, powerful dominant domestic interests. And that leads to the thrust for empire and the justification of that thrust as defensive. Now, going back to the population, it is submerged in doctrinal pronouncements of this kind. When enemies do it, we call it propaganda. When we do it, we call it education. But it's not very different. But an isolated individual faced with this deluge of propaganda, of doctrinal uniformity, does have a difficult time extricating himself or herself from it.
Finally, Professor Chomsky, many have predicted that the U.S. empire may be waning, that we're in this sort of twilight of empire phase. Do you have any sense that that might actually be true?
There has certainly been decline from the high point of power, which was 1945. But as I mentioned, that decline began right away. In late 1949, a large part of the empire was lost. There was immediate concern that Southeast Asia might be lost. That's the origins of the Vietnam War. It's concerns over Latin America, the Middle East. In the last decade, South America has gained substantial independence. By now they're very free from U.S. domination. It's an enormous change. That's the loss of South America, if you like it. So sure, the process of decline goes on, continues, waxes and wanes. It's not a steady process, but there is a tendency for power to become more diffused. But the United States is still overwhelming in many dimensions, crucially in the dimension of violence. The U.S. is far ahead of anyone else in military bases, military technology, far more advanced than anywhere, and even simple military spending. As I said, it's almost as much as the rest of the world combined. So empire is a complex affair. Yes, there's a decline, began in the 1940s, it's continuing, but has by no means abated.
Professor Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
On the next episode of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum, we'll talk to activist and author Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz about how the U.S. uses its experience of occupying indigenous peoples' lands in its effort to dominate other countries overseas.
So the imperialist urge was there from the beginning, and it got institutionalized. It's the core makeup of the U.S. Army today, and in almost every situation.
Noam Chomsky is a legendary political analyst, professor emeritus of linguistics at MIT, and author of over 100 books, and my interview with him is part of the Henry A. Wallace National Security Forum presented by Brave New Films. And on Thursday, we'll play the interview with Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz on the origins of American empire. This is Uprising. After the short break, Dahr Jamail joins us to discuss the Supreme Court ruling on EPA regulations of mercury emissions. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. After a series of high-profile losses at the Supreme Court, conservatives celebrated yesterday when the nation's highest court ruled against the Environmental Protection Agency's ability to regulate mercury and other toxic emissions from coal-fired plants, claiming that the EPA had not done a cost-benefit analysis of the standards it was expecting companies to meet. Justice Antonin Scalia claimed that it is not rational, quote, never mind appropriate to impose billions of dollars in economic costs in return for a few dollars in health or environmental benefits, end of quote. The 20 states that sued the EPA in conjunction with a number of fossil fuel companies claimed that the government agency was imposing billions of dollars in costs to achieve a few million in benefits. The ruling is not the end of the road, however. The EPA may be able to continue regulating toxic pollutants under the Clean Air Act once it conducts cost-benefit analyses. President Obama, stymied by congressional gridlock on climate change legislation, has attempted to use the authority of the EPA as a tool to curb greenhouse gas emissions to cement his environmental legacy. It should be noted, however, that the president has also championed such dirty fuels as fracking and tar sands and endorsed mythical products like clean coal. My guest is Dahr Jamail. He's a Truthout staff reporter. He's the author of The Will to Resist, Soldiers Who Refuse to Fight in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Beyond the Green Zone, dispatches from an unembedded journalist in occupied Iraq. He's won the Martha Gellhorn Award for Investigative Journalism, among other awards. Welcome back to the program, Dahr.
Thanks, Sonali. Good to be with you again.
Now, let's clarify what just happened. There are two sections of the Clean Air Act that the EPA is hoping to regulate coal plants under. One is mercury emissions and the other is carbon emissions. Both target coal plants. And this ruling that happened yesterday is about mercury emissions and other toxic substances. There is a lawsuit against the EPA's regulation of carbon emissions too, but that's going to come later. How do you understand this specific ruling?
I think it's very, very clear, and just to really cut to the bottom line, and I use the word bottom line intentionally. And Scalia's comments that you just mentioned really, I think, offer the perfect summary of the whole situation, where he literally said it is not worth spending billions of dollars to protect humans and the environment. That it's just that simple. It's another case, and this is where this particular court case and this victory for the coal industry and the fossil fuel industry really summarizes what's happening to the whole planet, where the financial bottom line trumps literally the health of the ecosystem and the atmosphere upon which we all rely to stay alive. And that's this case, I think, really illustrates that extremely clearly, that it's not worth doing the right thing, spending some extra money to kick in some environmental regulations. And let's be very clear, this isn't a do-gooder Obama, as you just mentioned, or a do-gooder EPA coming in really trying to do the right thing. This is putting a Band-Aid on a situation that needs open heart surgery. You know, the reality is we should not be burning any more fossil fuels whatsoever. We need to be transitioning at warp speed away from all fossil fuel generation and burning and production and into renewables on a national and global scale, just to mitigate the disaster that's already upon us. Not to change it, not to stop it, but just to hopefully take maybe a little bit of the edge off. And instead, it's, you know, pedal to the metal, full speed off the cliff. We are going to, you know, once again, profits trump everything, you know, human health, health of the environment, whatever. When it comes down to anything that's going to affect the bottom line of the fossil fuel industry, we're going to see even the Supreme Court stepping up to bat for them.
Now, Dahr, if the EPA did do a cost-benefit analysis and actually attached a dollar amount to the benefits of taking coal companies offline, I don't know how one really, I mean, there are ways to put dollar amounts on these things. Can it come back to properly regulating mercury? The EPA maintained that it didn't have to do an analysis as part of the Clean Air Act, but the Supreme Court said it did. So is there an opening here for the EPA?
Well, if there was going to be a cost-benefit analysis of that, I mean, I think the bottom drops out of that logic, and it is sound logic, but the bottom drops out rapidly because as we see time and time again, that next quarter's profit earnings statement trumps any long-term planning, looking down the road at consequences, despite the fact that there's actually a large number of scientifically vetted, peer-reviewed reports showing This is what climate change is going to cost, and it's literally in the trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. But that's not next quarter's profit earnings statement, and so that's going to be trumped by what do we need to do right now to earn as much money as quickly as possible. And that, again, is symptomatic of what's happening to the entire planet, where, we're not going to, take the steps that are going to require some of these massive industries to make a bit less money and start transitioning into something that's better for the planet, because that would basically negatively impact next quarter's profit statement.
Now, the court has taken up the mercury emissions regulation separately from the carbon emissions regulation, and the EPA has attempted to look at carbon dioxide itself, the most important greenhouse gas, as a pollutant under the Clean Air Act, which, of course, to those who understand climate change is happening and its impact, sounds like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But why has the court chosen to separate these two, and what impact does the ruling on mercury emissions and other toxic emissions have on a future ruling on carbon emissions being regulated by the EPA?
That's a really good point. I mean, I've definitely seen that there's, some folks are believing, well, this actually does set the stage that there is going to be a better chance now for some rulings in favor of some CO2 regulations coming down the path. But I've also, it's clear that this ruling yesterday sets a very clear precedent that it is going to be, I think, hard to overcome the inertia, where you've got the Supreme, an industry and the EPA went to battle. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and industry won. And that's going to be a very difficult precedent to overcome, even in regards to CO2, where, as you just said, the writing's completely on the wall. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about the impact of CO2 on the planet, what's happening, how much worse it's getting, how quickly. And this precedent now set, it's, I think, going to be a very, very steep uphill battle for the EPA or any other so-called theoretically regulating agency to come back and try to win another big case like this.
Now, Peabody Energy, the largest coal company in the United States, was among those that sued the EPA. And in the wake of the Supreme Court ruling, their stocks soared. How well are these energy companies doing? Because they're claiming that the costs of cleaning up these coal companies, the coal plants, is just too onerous. I mean, they can't spare a few $1 billion to stop polluting our air. Isn't the technology widely available, even if it might cost some?
Well, again, in just to look at it, I think pragmatically, from their perspective, it's all about maximizing profit in the short term and planning in the future of how to continue to do that even more. That's simply where they're coming from. So these
You're
people.
saying it's a mistake for me to expect the Peabody to actually care about human lives.
I do. It's just literally not in the DNA of the corporate mindset to put people, the environment, or the entire planet ahead of profit. It's not going to happen, and it's never going to happen by any of these big industries. And I haven't seen any indicator from any of the major fossil fuel companies or power production companies that indicates that they might even be willing to do that at some point. I just haven't seen it happen.
Now, based on the attempt by the EPA to regulate mercury emissions, a number of coal plants in the U.S. were shuttered, and I understand that many of them will remain shuttered despite this ruling. If so, does it mean that the EPA's move was a good one, even if it sort of failed at the Supreme Court?
Well, I think it's good in along the lines of what you just said, that at least some of these older plants that are the grosser emitters of the fleet have been retired and won't be reopened. And it's good in that it brings the spotlight onto the egregious nature of how fossil fuel giants and the coal industry and certain utility industries are literally running the country, even the Supreme Court. And I think it's important that people get to see that, where, for this brief moment, a spotlight is shown on how dysfunctional the system is, how intensely the stack is decked against people and or agencies that are really trying to do the right thing at this point in the crisis.
Now, let's turn to other environmental news. Recently, a study made huge waves when it determined definitively that we are entering the 6th great mass extinction on the planet. A scientist at the Autonomous University of Mexico found that the average rate of vertebrate species lost over the last century is over 100 times greater than the normal or background rate of extinction. And this has been something suspected for a while. You wrote about it last year. How serious is this study? And there is, of course, a direct link to climate change, right?
Absolutely, and the study is very, very clear about the direct link to climate change. And I think the title of the study, or just the simple fact that we have a peer-reviewed scientific paper now confirming what a lot of folks have already known. People have been talking about this and reporting on it for some time. Elizabeth Kolbert wrote a fantastic book called The Sixth Great Mass Extinction. I mean, it's clear that we've been in it for a long time, and basically now we've got, these scientific papers that take a long time to generate and get peer reviewed and published. Now we've actually got one confirming it. And it's, I don't know how much more dire news could people get about how far along we are regarding human caused climate disruption. We are literally well into the sixth great mass extinction. Another thing that this paper points out is that the extinction rates, the background rates now, actually exceed those of the Permian mass extinction, which is one of the previous mass extinction events known as the Great Dying, which killed off over 90% of all life on the entire planet. And so we're at a pace far ahead of that. And if that doesn't give people pause and have people really think and look and accept the seriousness of the situation we're in, and then from that context, look back at what Judge Scalia, the coal industry, fossil fuel industries, how they're just thumbing the nose and charging forward at profits. It really illustrates the complete insanity of the situation that we're in, because the reality is this scientific report, numerous others that are coming out every month, NASA data showing 2015 is already on track, well on track to become the hottest year in history for the globe again. This is happening every year. Temperature records being broke all across the country, all across the world. Other things like Sao Paulo on the brink, literally a mega city of over 20 million people on the brink of running completely out of water by August. Meanwhile, we're looking at the entire city of Manila. There's talk of having to try to move the entire city of Manila in the Philippines because of rising seas. I mean, the signs are abundant all around us and growing by the day.
And terrible heat waves in India and Pakistan earlier this year. In India, thousands of people killed. In Pakistan, almost 1,000 said to be killed. I mean, we should be looking, when we think about the idea of the sixth great mass extinction, at the extinction of the human species. It's
well, that's
one
exactly,
of the species that,
That's exactly right, Sonali. And this report did not pull any punches and actually mentioned that we are on the front end of this extinction event. These events do take a lot of time, although this one that we're in, that we have set off ourselves, will probably be one of the fastest, if not the fastest, in even geologic history of the planet. And they mentioned in the report that humans are going to be on the front wave of the first wave of species, that we will most likely be included in the first wave of species that go extinct.
Well, finally, President Obama, in the last 2 years of his presidency, is worried about his legacy, and to the extent that the rest of us should worry about it. What is the at this point, after this ruling by the Supreme Court, what attempt do you think will he and can he make to put forward some kind of environmental legacy? Because in that desire for a legacy may lie some hope to curb climate change.
Well, as you mentioned earlier, President Obama is no environmentalist. This recent court ruling, and again, let's make it clear, this wasn't even an attempt by the EPA to really do the right thing with coal-fired power plants. This was, again, an attempt of them to put a Band-Aid on something that needs to basically have open heart surgery or just left to die and go away completely. In Obama's legacy, I mean, we have to keep in mind the fact that he's opened up massive amounts of the Atlantic seaboard to fracking, offshore fracking, same in the Gulf of Mexico. Drilling and fracking across the country has gone crazy under President Obama's reign. Look at what's happening with Shell, bringing, literally as we speak, their drill rigs are being towed up to the Chukchi Sea to begin oil drilling up in the Arctic. They're wargaming the Navy up in the Gulf of Alaska in preparations for the melting sea ice in the summer up in the Arctic ice pack to go away, so that there can be drilling happening up there. And so it's all of these things have to be taken into account when we talk about Obama and any kind of environmental legacy. I don't really see any really truly positive, let alone revolutionary moves that should be being made at this point in time in the history of the planet and the history of this species. And instead, it's kind of more half measures, more, I think, political gestures to kind of maybe set up whoever the next Democratic presidential candidate's going to be to try to bring more people into the big tent of the Democratic Party. And I think that's any moves he makes at this point in the game for him. I think that's the perspective they should be viewed from.
Dahr, where's the best place for people to read your writings?
Truthout.org.
And we will post a link to that at our website, Uprising with Sonali, later today, truthout.org. And Dahr also wrote a piece on this latest ruling by the Supreme Court on the EPA. And we'll certainly follow up on what the Supreme Court might be doing on the EPA's attempt to regulate carbon emissions directly. Dahr, thanks as always for joining us.
Thank you, Sonali.
My guest, Dahr Jamail, is a Truthout staff reporter who's won numerous awards for his work. And before we end the program today, exactly a week from today, Max Blumenthal will be speaking in Southern California at the First Congregational Church of Los Angeles as part of an event for Uprising. I'll be interviewing him on stage, and we would love to see you there. Tickets are available at kpfk.org. They are extremely limited, and poet Cholet will be there as well. Again, that's Tuesday, July 7th at 7 p.m. at the First Congregational Church in downtown LA. Tickets available at kpfk.org. That's for our Southern California audience. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor and audio engineer, as well as Federico Garcia is our audio engineer. Special thanks to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator, and subscribe to our YouTube channel right now at youtube.com/Uprising with Sonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.